Elena Martinez had always known her life wasn't really her own. Growing up in the small Texas border town of San Miguel, she watched other girls her age dream about college, careers, and choosing their own husbands. But Elena's dreams were different, because they had to be. Her father, Roberto Martinez, owned 3 successful restaurants and had his fingers in half the businesses in town. With that success came expectations, and those expectations had shaped Elena's entire world. From the time she was 15, Elena knew she would marry Vincent Calderon. It wasn't a romantic story or even a practical one from her perspective. It was business, pure and simple. Vincent's father, Carlos Calderon, controlled most of the trucking routes between San Miguel and the border crossings. Together, the Martinez restaurants and Calderon transportation could dominate the local economy. All they needed was a union to seal the deal, and Elena was that union. "It's not so bad, Mia," her mother would say whenever Elena looked sad during discussions about the wedding. "Vincent is handsome and his family has money. You'll have a good life." But Elena noticed how her mother's eyes never quite met hers when she said these things, and how her voice got a little too bright, like she was trying to convince herself as much as Elena tried to make the best of it. She really did. When she turned 80, the meetings with Vincent became more frequent and more formal. They would sit in her family's living room with both sets of parents present, making awkward conversation about their future together. Vincent was indeed handsome, with dark hair and sharp features that made the other girls in town jealous of Elena's good fortune. But there was something in his eyes that made her stomach twist with unease. The first real warning sign came during a family dinner when Elena was 19. Vincent had been talking about his plans to expand his father's business, and Elena had made an innocent suggestion about maybe adding refrigerated trucks to transport fresh produce. The conversation stopped completely. Vincent's jaw tightened, and his dark eyes fixed on her with an intensity that made her shrink back in her chair. "Women shouldn't worry about business," he said quietly, but there was steel in his voice. "That's not your place." Elena's father had laughed nervously and changed the subject, but Elena caught the look that passed between her parents. It was the same look she'd seen when the neighbor's dog had been hit by a car, a mixture of pity and helplessness. As the months passed, Elena began to notice more disturbing things about Vincent. He was charming with the adults, always respectful to both sets of parents, but his true nature came out in smaller moments. She watched him berate a waiter who had taken too long with their order, his voice low and threatening. She saw how he grabbed his younger sister's arm when she tried to leave a family gathering early, his grip tight enough to leave marks. Most troubling of all, she began hearing whispers about his previous engagement. Isabella Morales had been Vincent's first intended bride, chosen when they were both barely out of high school. Elena had always been told that Isabella had simply changed her mind and moved away to live with relatives in California. But as Elena got older and began listening more carefully to the conversations that stopped when she entered a room, she learned the truth. Isabella had run away in the middle of the night, leaving behind a note that said she couldn't go through with the marriage. What the note didn't say, but what the women in town whispered to each other, was that Isabella had been covered in bruises the last time anyone saw her. Elena tried to push these thoughts away. Maybe the stories about Isabella were exaggerated. Maybe Vincent was just having a hard time adjusting to the idea of marriage. Maybe she was being too sensitive, too worried about nothing. But deep down, in the part of her heart that she tried to keep quiet, Elena knew she was in real danger. The breaking point came on a warm Tuesday evening in March, just 3 weeks before their scheduled wedding. Elena and Vincent had been left alone in the garden behind her family's house while their parents discussed final wedding arrangements inside. Vincent had been unusually quiet all evening, and Elena had made the mistake of asking if something was wrong. "Everything's wrong," Vincent had said, his voice tight with frustration. "The flowers are wrong, the music is wrong, and you ... He had turned to face her then, and Elena saw something in his expression that made her blood run cold. "You're going to be my wife, Elena. Do you understand what that means?" Elena had nodded, not trusting her voice, but apparently her response wasn't enthusiastic enough. Vincent had grabbed her wrist, his fingers digging into her skin with shocking strength. "It means you belong to me. It means you don't question me, you don't embarrass me, and you certainly don't give me attitude like you've been doing." Elena had tried to pull away, but Vincent's grip only tightened. "Vincent, you're hurting me," she had whispered, looking toward the house where she could see the silhouettes of their parents through the window. "Good," Vincent had said, his voice so low only she could hear it. "Because if you think this hurts, wait until you see what happens when you disobey me after we're married." Isabella learned that lesson the hard way. The threat hung in the air between them like poison. Elena felt her knees go weak, and for a moment she thought she might actually faint. Vincent had released her wrist then, smoothing his hair back and adjusting his shirt as if nothing had happened. When their parents came back outside a few minutes later, he was the perfect gentleman again, helping Elena to her feet and commenting on how lovely the garden looked in the evening light. That night, Elena lay in bed staring at the ceiling, her wrist throbbing where Vincent had grabbed her. In the morning there would be bruises, dark purple marks in the shape of his fingers. She could already imagine the conversation with her mother, the explanations about how Vincent was just stressed about the wedding, how all men got a little aggressive sometimes, how it was normal and she shouldn't worry, but Elena was done with. Normal? She was done with accepting things that felt wrong just because everyone else said they were right. She was done with being a business transaction disguised as a bride, quietly. So, as not to wake her parents, Elena got up and went to her grandmother's old room. Her grandmother had passed away 2 years earlier, but Elena still kept the room exactly as it had been. Behind a loose floorboard under the bed, Elena found what she was looking for, a small wooden box containing her grandmother's emergency. Money, nearly $3,000 in cash that her grandmother had saved, just in case. Elena counted the bills twice, her hands shaking. It wasn't much, but it might be enough to get her far away from San Miguel, far away from Vincent, far away from the life that had been planned for her before. She was old enough to have an opinion about it. She spent the rest of the night packing. A small bag with only the essentials, a few changes of clothes, her grandmother's rosary, her birth certificate, and the cash. As the sun began to rise, Elena took one last look around the room where she had spent her entire life dreaming of freedom. In a few hours, her parents would wake up and find her gone. They would be angry, disappointed, maybe even heartbroken. But Elena knew that if she stayed, she might not live to see her 25th birthday. With her bag in hand and her heart pounding, Elena Martinez walked out of her family's house and into the uncertain freedom of the early morning darkness. Behind her, she left everything she had ever known. Ahead of her lay a future that was completely unknown, but for the first time in her life, it was entirely her own to choose. Elena's old pickup truck had been making strange noises for the last 50 miles, but she had pushed it as far as she could. 3 days of driving through back roads and sleeping in the truck had taken their toll on both her and the vehicle. When black smoke started pouring from under the hood just outside a town called Millfield, Elena knew her running was over, at least for now. She pulled into the first gas station she saw, her hands shaking as she turned off the engine. The silence that followed was deafening. No more rumbling engine to drown out her thoughts. No more road stretching endlessly ahead to give her the illusion of escape. Just her, a broken truck, and a town she'd never heard of and a state she'd never visited. The mechanic, a kind older man named Pete, took one look under the hood and shook his head. "I'm real sorry, miss, but this engine's done for. Would cost more to fix than the truck's worth." Elena felt her heart sink as he continued. "I could give you maybe $300 for it as scrap, but that's about all she's good for now. $300. Elena counted the remaining cash in her grandmother's box. After gas, food, and a few cheap motel rooms, she had less than $2,000 left. In her old life, that might have been spending money for a weekend shopping trip. Now it was all that stood between her and complete disaster. Millfield wasn't much to look at. Main Street stretched for about 6 blocks, with a few shops, a small bank, a post office, and what looked like the town's only restaurant, a place called May's Diner. The buildings were old but well maintained, and Elena noticed that most of The pickup trucks parked along the street were clean and cared for, even if they weren't new. It was the kind of town where people knew each other's names and probably each other's business, too. Elena found a small motel at the edge of town, the kind with thin walls and a neon sign that flickered intermittently. The room was clean enough, and at $40 a night it was cheaper than anything she'd stayed in during her journey. But at that rate, her money would last less than 2 months. She needed work, and she needed it fast. The next morning, Elena walked into May's diner, with her heart pounding. She'd never had a real job before. In her old life, she'd helped out at her father's restaurant sometimes, but that was different. This was her first time walking into a place where nobody knew her name or her family, where she'd have to prove herself from scratch. The diner was busy with the breakfast crowd, mostly men in work clothes and cowboy hats grabbing coffee and eggs before heading to their jobs. The woman behind the counter was probably in her 50s, with graying hair pulled back in a practical ponytail and eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. "You looking for a table, honey?" the woman asked, balancing 3 plates on one arm while pouring coffee with the other. "Actually, I was hoping to ask about work," Elena said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I saw the help wanted sign in the window." The woman, who Elena would soon learn was May herself, stopped what she was doing and really looked at her for the first time. Elena was acutely aware of how she must appear, tired, nervous, and obviously not from around here. "You ever waited tables before?" May asked, not unkindly. Elena shook her head. "No, ma'am, but I'm willing to learn. I'm a hard worker, and I really need this job." Something in Elena's voice must have convinced May, because she nodded toward an empty booth. "Sit down, honey. Let me get through this breakfast rush, and then we'll talk." Elena watched May work for the next hour, amazed by how effortlessly she handled the chaos of the morning crowd. May knew everyone's order before they said it, remembered how each customer liked their coffee, and managed to keep up a steady stream of conversation while never missing a beat with the food service. When the crowd finally thinned out, May poured 2 cups of coffee and sat across from Elena. "I'm May Hendricks, and I've been running this place for 23 years, she said. "Now, I don't usually hire folks I don't know, but I've got a good feeling about you. What's your name, and what brings you to Millfield?" Elena had rehearsed this moment during her long drive, but sitting across from May's kind but shrewd eyes, she found herself sticking as close to the truth as she dared. "I'm Rose," she said, using her middle name, Rose Martinez. "I'm from Texas, but I needed a fresh start somewhere new." May nodded slowly, running from something or running to something. The question caught Elena off guard. I'm not sure." "I understand. Honey, I've been in this business long enough to spot someone who's running. Question is whether you're running from trouble or running toward a better life. Makes a difference to me." Elena felt tears threaten, but she blinked them back. "Running toward something better, I hope." May's expression softened. "That's what I thought. You've got that look about you, like you're scared, but determined. I can work with determined." She leaned back in the booth. "Job pays minimum wage plus tips. You work breakfast and lunch shift, 6 days a week. I'll give you Sundays off. You'll start tomorrow morning at 5:30, and I'll teach you everything you need to know. Deal?" Elena felt a weight lift from her shoulders that she hadn't even realized she was carrying. "Deal, thank you, May. You won't regret this." "I'd better not," May said with a smile. "Now, you need a uniform. I've got some extra aprons in the back, and you'll need comfortable shoes. Where are you staying?" Elena told her about the motel, and May frowned. "That place is fine for a night or two, but it's not somewhere you want to live. Let me think about it. There might be something better available." Elena's first few days at the diner were exhausting but oddly satisfying. She learned to balance plates, remember orders, and navigate the narrow space between tables without bumping into customers. Her feet hurt, her back ached, and she collapsed into bed each night completely drained, but for the first time in her life she was earning her own money through her own efforts. The customers were mostly kind, though she could tell they were curious about the new waitress who spoke with a slight accent and seemed jumpier than necessary. Elena kept her head down, answered questions politely but briefly, and focused on doing her job well. It was during her second week that she first noticed Jake Thompson. He came in every Tuesday and Thursday morning, always sat at the same corner booth, and always ordered the same thing: black coffee, 2 eggs over easy, wheat toast, and a side of hash browns. He was probably in his early 30s, with sun-weathered skin and calloused hands that spoke of hard outdoor work. Unlike some of the other customers who tried to make conversation or flirt, Jake simply nodded politely when she took his order and said, "Thank you," when she brought his food. There was something different about him, though Elena couldn't quite put her finger on what it was. Maybe it was the way he never let his eyes linger on her uncomfortably, or how he always had exact change ready so she wouldn't have to fumble with the register. Or maybe it was just that he seemed completely comfortable with silence, reading a worn paperback book while he ate, never demanding her attention like some customers did. Elena found herself looking forward to Jake's visits, though she told herself it was just because he was an easy customer. He never complained about the food, never made inappropriate comments, and always left a generous tip. In a job where she was constantly on edge, trying to blend in and avoid drawing attention to herself, Jake's quiet presence was oddly comforting. May noticed Elena's progress and seemed pleased. "You're getting the hang of it," she said one afternoon, as they cleaned up after the lunch rush. "Customers like you, and you're picking up the work faster than most." Elena felt a flush of pride. "Thank you. I really appreciate you giving me a chance." "Well, I've got some more good news for you. My friend Lucy has a small apartment above the hardware store. Nothing fancy, but it's clean and safe, and she's looking for a reliable tenant. Rent's $300 a month, utilities included. You interested?" Elena's heart jumped. Her own place, somewhere she could lock the door and feel truly safe. Yes, absolutely. "When can I see it?" "Lucy's bringing the keys by tomorrow morning. If you like it, you can move in this weekend." As Elena lay in her motel bed that night, she allowed herself to feel something she hadn't felt in months: hope. She had a job, soon she'd have her own apartment, and for the first time since leaving home, she was beginning to believe that maybe, just maybe, she could build a new life for herself in this small town at the edge of nowhere, outside her window. The neon sign flickered against the darkness, but Elena no longer saw it as a symbol of her desperate circumstances. Instead, it felt like a lighthouse, guiding her toward the safety of solid ground after months of being lost at sea. Elena had been working at May's Diner for almost 2 months when the spring storm hit Millfield. She'd grown comfortable with her routine: wake up at 5 in the morning, walk the 3 blocks from her small apartment to the diner, work through the breakfast and lunch rush, then head home to her quiet evening routine of reading library books and writing in a journal she'd started keeping. The apartment above the hardware store had become her sanctuary. It was small, just 1 room with a tiny kitchen and bathroom, but it was hers. She'd bought second-hand furniture from the local thrift store and hung cheerful yellow curtains that Lucy had helped her pick out. For the first time in her life, Elena was living in a space that reflected her own choices rather than someone else's expectations. Her friendship with May had deepened too. May had a way of knowing when Elena needed to talk and when she needed to be left alone. Sometimes, after the diner closed, they'd sit together drinking coffee, and May would share stories about the town and its people. Elena learned that May had also come to Millfield as a young woman, running from her own difficult past, and had built her life here one day at a time. Jake had become part of Elena's routine as well. He still came in twice a week, still ordered the same meal, still read his book quietly while he ate. But now Elena noticed small things about him that she'd missed before. The way he always wiped down his table before leaving, making her job a little easier. How he'd nod toward the kitchen when May was having a particularly stressful day, as if checking to make sure she was okay. The fact that his book was always something different: romance novels, mysteries, biographies, like he read everything he could get his hands on. Elena had started looking forward to their brief exchanges. "Morning, Jake," she'd say when he came in, and he'd smile and reply, "Morning, Rose. How are you doing today?" It wasn't much, but in a life where she was still learning to trust people, Jake's consistency felt like a small gift. The storm began. On a Tuesday afternoon in early April, Elena noticed the sky darkening while she was serving lunch. But spring storms were common in this part of the country. She'd experienced plenty of them growing up in Texas. What she hadn't expected was for this particular storm to be so fierce and lasting. By 3 o'clock. The wind was howling outside the diner windows and rain was coming down in sheets. May was checking the weather report on her phone, her expression growing more concerned by the minute. "They're saying this storm system is going to park itself right over us," she told Elena. "Could be here for days." Elena felt a flutter of anxiety. Her apartment was comfortable, but she'd never weathered a serious storm alone before. Back home, her family had always gathered together during bad weather. And despite everything that had happened, she found herself missing that sense of security. The diner's last customer left around 4:30, and May started making preparations to close early. "No point staying open when nobody can get here safely," she said, unplugging the coffee makers and covering the pie display. "You better head home before this gets worse." Elena was putting on her jacket when the lights flickered and went out. Completely. Through the windows, she could see that the power was out all down Main Street. May had a flashlight behind the counter, and in its beam, Elena could see the concern on her boss's face. "Well, that changes things," May said. "I've got a generator at home, but I don't like the idea of you walking to your apartment in this. The power lines could be down, and with this wind there's bound to be debris in the streets." Elena was about to insist she'd be fine when the door chimed and Jake Thompson stepped inside, shaking rain from his coat. He was soaked despite his rain gear, and Elena realized he must have driven through the storm to get here. "Evening, ladies," Jake said, his voice calm despite the chaos outside. "I was driving by and saw your lights go out. Everything all right?" May looked relieved to see him. "Jake, thank goodness. I was just worrying about Rose getting home safely in this mess." Jake looked at Elena, and she saw genuine concern in his eyes. "Where are you staying?" "The apartment above Morrison's Hardware," Elena said. "It's only 3 blocks. I'm sure I can make it." Jake shook his head. "I just came from that direction. There's a power line down across Pine Street, and the water's already knee-deep in some places. It's not safe for walking." Elena felt a wave of helplessness wash over her. She'd been so proud of her independence, of taking care of herself, but now she felt like that frightened girl who'd fled from Texas all over again. "I'll drive you," Jake said simply. "My truck can handle the water better than most vehicles." Elena hesitated. She'd been so careful about trusting people, especially men, since arriving in Millfield. But something about Jake's straightforward manner and the way May nodded approvingly made her feel safer. "If you're sure it's not too much trouble, Elena," said Jake smiled. "No trouble at all." They made their way to Jake's truck, fighting against the wind and rain. Elena was soaked through by the time they reached the vehicle, despite the short distance. Jake's truck was older but well-maintained, with a powerful engine that handled the flooded streets with ease. When they reached the hardware store, Jake peered through the windshield at the building. "Looks like the power's out here too," he said. "You sure you'll be okay up there by yourself?" Elena was about to say yes when a particularly strong gust of wind rocked the truck. Through the rain, she could see debris flying through the air, and she realized that being alone in a powerless building during a storm like this might not be the smartest idea. "Actually," Jake said, seeming to read her thoughts, "my place is just outside town, and I've got a generator. You're welcome to wait out the storm there if you'd be more comfortable. I've got a spare room, and my housekeeper, Mrs. Chin, left plenty of food before she went to visit her daughter." Elena's first instinct was to refuse. She'd been so careful about maintaining her independence, about not owing anything. But as another gust of wind shook the truck, she realized that sometimes accepting help wasn't a sign of weakness, but of wisdom. "Are you sure?" she asked. "I don't want to impose." "You're not imposing?" Jake said. "To be honest, I'd feel better knowing you're somewhere safe rather than worrying about you riding out this storm alone." Something in his tone convinced her. Jake wasn't offering help because he expected something in return, but because he genuinely cared about her well-being. It was a kindness she hadn't experienced often in her life. "Okay," Elena said. "Thank you. I really appreciate this." Jake's ranch house was about 15 minutes outside town, down a winding road that was barely visible through the storm. The house itself was modest but welcoming, with a covered porch and warm lights glowing from the windows. Jake had been right about the generator, Elena realized, as they pulled up to a building that was clearly the only one in the area with power. Jake parked as close to the front door as possible and grabbed Elena's bag from the truck bed. "Run for it," he said, and they both sprinted through the rain to the porch. Inside, the house was warm and dry, a stark contrast to the chaos outside. Elena looked around, taking in the comfortable furniture, the books lining the walls, and the photographs of horses and landscapes that decorated the mantel. It was the home of someone who valued simple pleasures and quiet moments. "Let me get you a towel," Jake said, disappearing down the hallway. He returned with a fluffy blue towel and a dry sweatshirt. "The guest room is just down the hall. You can change into something warm and I'll make us some coffee." Elena took the towel gratefully, surprised by how thoughtful Jake was being. In her old life, men had often offered help as a way of creating obligation or gaining advantage. But Jake's kindness felt genuine, with no strings attached. The guest room was simple but comfortable, with a handmade quilt on the bed and fresh flowers on the nightstand. Elena changed into the warm sweatshirt, which smelled faintly of laundry detergent and something uniquely Jake, and felt herself beginning to relax for the first time since the storm began. When she returned to the living room, Jake had coffee ready and was adding logs to the fireplace. "Figured we might as well be comfortable," he said. "The weather report says this storm could last until Thursday." Elena settled onto the couch, wrapping her hands around the warm mug. Outside, the wind continued to howl, but inside Jake's house, she felt safer than she had in months. For the first time since leaving Texas, she wasn't looking over her shoulder or planning her next move. She was simply present, in this moment, with this kind man who had offered her shelter without expecting anything in return. "Jake," she said softly, "thank you for this. I don't know what I would have done." Jake looked at her from his chair by the fire, his expression serious. "Everyone needs help sometimes, Rose. The trick is knowing when to ask for it and when to accept it." As the storm raged outside, Elena began to understand that maybe, just maybe, she'd found more than just a job and an apartment in Millfield. Maybe she'd found the beginning of a home. Elena had been living in Millfield for almost 6 months when her past finally caught up with her. The storm had been a turning point in her relationship with Jake. After spending 3 days at his ranch house, she'd seen a side of him that made her begin to believe that maybe not all men were like Vincent. Jake had been nothing but respectful, giving her space when she needed it, and offering quiet companionship when she seemed ready for it. They'd started spending more time together after the storm. Jake would sometimes stay for an extra cup of coffee after his meal at the diner, and Elena found herself looking forward to these conversations. He told her about his horses, about growing up on the ranch, about the books he was reading. She shared carefully edited stories about her childhood in Texas, her love of cooking, and her dreams of maybe opening her own restaurant someday. Elena had even started joining Jake and some of the other locals for the occasional movie night at the community center or the monthly potluck dinners at the church. She was still careful about sharing too much personal information, but she was beginning to feel like she might actually have a future in this small town. That sense of security shattered on a humid Tuesday morning in August. Elena was working the breakfast shift when she noticed a black sedan parked across the street from the diner. It was the kind of car that looked expensive and out of place in Millfield, where most people drove pickup trucks or older sedans. Something about it made her nervous, though she couldn't put her finger on why. The morning rush was busier than usual, and Elena pushed her worries aside as she focused on keeping up with the orders. May was in the kitchen dealing with a broken grill, and Elena was handling the front of the house by herself. She was refilling coffee for a table of construction workers when she heard the bell, Above the door chime, Elena looked up and felt her. Blood turned to ice. Vincent Calderon was standing in the doorway of May's diner, looking around the room with the same cold, calculating expression she remembered from their engagement. He was dressed in an expensive suit that made him stand out like a sore thumb among the working-class customers, and his dark eyes scanned the room until they found her. The coffee pot in Elena's hand began to shake, so badly that she had to set it down on the table. Vincent's lips curved into a smile that didn't reach his eyes as he walked toward her, moving with the confident stride of someone who was used to getting what he wanted. "Hello, Elena," Vincent said, his voice carrying easily across the suddenly quiet diner, or should I say Rose? "I have to admit, you had me fooled for a while with that little name change." Elena felt like she couldn't breathe. The other customers were staring now, sensing the tension in the air even if they didn't understand what was happening. She was vaguely aware of May coming out of the kitchen, wiping her hands on her apron, her face creased with concern. "Vincent." Elena managed to whisper, "How did you find me?" Vincent's smile widened. "Did you really think you could just disappear? My father hired the best private investigator in Texas. It took a few months, but here we are." He gestured around the diner. With obvious disdain, "I have to say, this is quite a step down from the life you were meant to have." Elena's legs felt weak, and she gripped the edge of the table for support. "I'm not going back," she said, surprised by the steadiness in her own voice. Vincent's expression darkened. "Oh, but you are. You see, you belong to me, Elena. We had a contract, a promise between our families. You can't just run away from your obligations." "I don't belong to anyone," Elena said, her voice growing stronger. The months of independence, of making her own decisions and building her own life, had given her a confidence she'd never had before. Vincent stepped closer, and Elena could see the anger building in his eyes. "You embarrass me, Elena. You embarrassed both our families. Do you have any idea what I've had to deal with because of your little stunt?" May stepped forward then, positioning herself slightly between Elena and Vincent. "I think you need to leave," she said firmly. "This is a private business, and you're disturbing my customers." Vincent barely glanced at May. "This doesn't concern you, old woman. This is between me and my fiancé." "Ex-fiancé," Elena corrected, finding her voice again. "There's no engagement, Vincent. I left. It's over." Vincent's face flushed red, and Elena saw the familiar signs of his temper beginning to flare. "You don't get to decide that," he said, his voice rising. "You made a commitment, and you're going to honor it." He reached for Elena's arm, his fingers closing around her wrist, with the same painful grip she remembered from that night in her parents' garden. "You're coming home with me right now." Elena tried to pull away, but Vincent's grip tightened. "Let go of me," she said, her voice shaking. "I don't think so," Vincent replied. "I've spent 6 months looking for you, and I'm not leaving without you." It was at that moment that Jake Thompson walked through the door of the diner. He took in the scene immediately, Elena struggling to free herself from Vincent's grip, May standing nearby with her hands clenched into fists, and the other customers watching with growing alarm. Jake didn't say anything at first. He simply walked over to where Vincent was holding Elena and stood there, his presence somehow commanding despite his quiet demeanor. He was wearing his usual work clothes, dusty jeans, and a flannel shirt, but there was something in his posture that made Vincent take notice. "I think the lady asked you to let go," Jake said, his voice calm but carrying an underlying tone of steel that Elena had never heard before. Vincent looked Jake up and down dismissively. "This doesn't concern you, cowboy. This is between me and my woman." "I'm not your woman," Elena said firmly, still trying to free her wrist. Jake's eyes never left Vincent's face. "She's right, she's not your woman. So I'm going to ask you one more time, politely, to let go of her." Vincent's grip on Elena's wrist tightened painfully. "And what if I don't?" "What are you going to do about it?" Jake stepped closer, and Elena could see the muscles in his arms tense. "I really don't think you want to find out." There was something in Jake's tone that made Vincent reconsider. He was used to intimidating people with his father's money and connections, but Jake didn't seem impressed by either. Vincent released Elena's wrist abruptly, causing her to stumble backward. "This isn't over," Vincent said, his voice full of venom. "Elena, you belong to me. You signed a contract, and so did your father. I have legal rights here." Elena rubbed her wrist, which was already beginning to show red marks where Vincent had gripped her. "I was never legally bound to marry you, Vincent. You know that?" Vincent's smile was cold. "Maybe not legally, but there are other kinds of contracts. Your father owes my family money, Elena, a lot of money. The marriage was supposed to settle that debt. If there's no marriage, then your father is going to have to pay up, and I don't think he has that kind of cash lying around." Elena felt her heart sink. She'd known the marriage was about business, but she hadn't realized her father was actually in debt to the Calderon family. "That's between you and my father," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. "No, it's not," Vincent replied. "Because you're the collateral, Elena. You always have been. So you can come home with me now, or you can watch your father lose everything he's worked for. Your choice?" Elena felt tears threatening, but she refused to let them fall in front of Vincent. After everything she'd been through, after building a new life for herself, the thought of going back to that world of fear and control was unbearable. Jake moved to stand beside Elena, his presence solid and reassuring. "I think you've said enough," he told Vincent. "Elena's made her choice, and you need to respect that." Vincent laughed harshly. "And what are you going to do to stop me? You're nothing but a ranch hand in a nowhere town. I have lawyers, I have connections, I have money. You think you can protect her from me?" Jake's expression didn't change. "I think you'd be surprised what people in a nowhere town can do when someone they care about is being threatened." As if on cue, Elena noticed that the other customers in the diner had quietly moved closer. Pete the mechanic was standing near the door, blocking Vincent's exit. The construction workers had pushed back from their table, ready to intervene if needed. Even May had picked up the phone behind the counter, her finger hovering over the buttons. Vincent seemed to realize for the first time that he was outnumbered. His confident demeanor faltered slightly as he looked around the room at the faces of people who clearly didn't appreciate his presence. "This isn't over," he said again, but his voice lacked its earlier certainty. "Elena, you have 1 week to think about this. After that, I'll be back with legal papers and a court order. You can come home willingly, or you can come home the hard way." He turned and walked toward the door, pausing only to add, "And as for you, Cowboy, you might want to think twice about getting involved in things that don't concern you." Jake stepped forward slightly. "Everything that concerns Elena concerns me. You might want to remember that." Vincent left without another word, and Elena felt her knees give way. Jake caught her before she could fall, his strong arm steadying her as she struggled to process what had just happened. "It's okay," Jake said softly. "He's gone, you're safe." But Elena knew that wasn't true. Vincent would be back, and next time he'd be prepared for resistance. The week after Vincent's visit felt like the longest of Elena's life. She jumped at every sound, checked over her shoulder constantly, and barely slept. Jake had insisted on driving her to and from work each day, and May had made it clear that Elena was never to be alone in the diner. The whole town seemed to rally around her, with customers lingering longer than usual, and Pete the mechanic finding excuses to stop by for coffee throughout the day. Jake had taken Elena to see a lawyer in the county seat, a sharp-eyed woman named Patricia Wells, who specialized in family law. After hearing Elena's story, Patricia had been blunt about the situation. "The good news is that you can't be forced into marriage," she'd said. "The bad news is that if your father really does owe the Calderon family money, they might have legal remedies to collect that debt." Elena had called her mother that night, something she hadn't done since leaving Texas. The conversation had been painful. Her mother had cried, begging Elena to come home and make things right. "Your father is sick with worry," her mother had said. "The stress is killing him. Vincent says he'll forgive everything if you just come back." But Elena had held firm. "I won't marry Vincent, Mama, I can't. You don't understand what he's really like. He's a good man from a good family," her mother had insisted. "You're just being stubborn." Elena had hung up feeling more alone than ever, but also more determined. She'd rather lose her family than lose herself. Vincent returned exactly 1 week later, just as he'd promised. This time he brought a lawyer with him, a stern-looking man in an expensive suit who carried a briefcase full of documents. They arrived at the diner during the lunch rush, clearly hoping to catch Elena off guard and surrounded by witnesses. "Elena Martinez," the lawyer had announced loudly, "you're being served with a civil lawsuit for breach of contract and damages in the amount of $500,000. Elena's hands had shaken as she'd taken the papers, but she'd managed to keep her voice steady. "I need to give these to my lawyer." Vincent had smiled coldly. "Your lawyer can't help you, Elena. My family has connections you can't imagine. We'll tie you up in court for years if we have to." It was Jake who had stepped forward then, his voice calm but firm. "I think you've delivered your message." "Time to go?" Vincent's eyes had narrowed. Cowboy, I've been doing some research on you too. Jake Thompson, 32 years old, manages the Hartley Ranch, makes about $40,000 a year. Think you can afford to fight a legal battle against the Calderon family?" Jake had smiled then, an expression that didn't reach his eyes. "You might be surprised what I can afford." The legal battle that followed was grueling. Vincent's family had deep pockets and excellent lawyers, and they seemed determined to make Elena's life as difficult as possible. They filed motion after motion, demanded depositions, and tried to paint Elena as a gold-digging runaway who had violated her sacred promise to their family, but Elena wasn't fighting alone. Patricia Wells proved to be a formidable opponent, and she seemed to take Vincent's threats personally. More importantly, Jake had somehow assembled a legal team that rivaled anything the Calderon family could throw at him. Elena had been puzzled by this until May had finally explained. "Honey, Jake's not just a ranch manager. His grandfather was one of the biggest cattle barons in the state. Jake inherited more money than most people see in a lifetime, but he's never been one to show off about it." Elena had stared at May in shock. "Why didn't he tell me?" May had smiled. "Because he wanted you to know him for who he is, not what he has. Jake's a good man who happens to have money, not a rich man who happens to be good." Throughout the legal proceedings, Jake had been Elena's constant support. He'd driven her to depositions, sat with her during long meetings with lawyers, and held her hand when she'd cried from frustration and fear. He'd never once made her feel like she owed him anything for his help. The breakthrough came when Patricia Wells managed to track down Isabella Morales, Vincent's first fiancée. Isabella had been living quietly in California, working as a teacher, and raising her young daughter. She'd been terrified to come forward, but when she learned that Vincent was trying to force another woman into marriage, she'd agreed to testify. Isabella's testimony had been devastating to Vincent's case. She described years of emotional and physical abuse, threats against her family, and ultimately her desperate escape in the middle of the night. The judge had listened with growing disgust as Isabella had detailed Vincent's pattern of controlling behavior. "This court finds no evidence of a binding contract," the judge had finally ruled. Furthermore, the defendant's history of intimidation and threats against women suggests that any such contract would be void as a matter of public policy. Elena had cried with relief as Vincent's case had crumbled around him. But the victory had come with a price. Her father's debt to the Calderon family was real, and without the marriage to settle it, her family had lost their restaurants and their home. Elena had tried to send money to help, but her father had been too proud to accept it. The last letter she'd received from her mother had been short and cold. "You've gotten what you wanted. I hope it was worth destroying your family." The words had cut deep, but Elena had learned to live with the pain. She'd made her choice, and while it hadn't been easy, she knew it had been right. In the months that followed, Elena had thrown herself into building her new life. She'd enrolled in business classes at the community college, saving money with the goal of eventually opening her own restaurant. May had been talking about retiring, and Elena had begun to dream of taking over the diner and expanding it. Jake had been patient through it all. He'd never pushed her for more than she was ready to give, but Elena could see the love in his eyes whenever he looked at her. She'd found herself falling for him too, but trust didn't come easily after everything she'd been through. The turning point came on a warm Evening in late September. Elena had been working late, doing inventory for May, when Jake had appeared at the diner with takeout from the Chinese restaurant in the next town over. "Thought you might be hungry," he'd said simply. They'd eaten together at one of the back booths, talking about their days, their dreams, their fears. Elena had found herself really looking at Jake for the first time in months, seeing not just the man who had protected her, but the man who had quietly loved her through her darkest moments. "Jake," she'd said suddenly, "why did you help me?" "Really? Help me? I mean, you could have just called the police that day Vincent showed up." Jake had been quiet for a long moment, turning his coffee cup in his hands. "Because I recognized something in you that first day you came to the diner. You looked like someone who was running from something terrible, but also like someone who was strong enough to build something better." Elena had felt tears prick her eyes. "I've never had anyone believe in me like that." "Well, you do now," Jake had said softly. Elena had reached across the table and taken his hand then, feeling the calluses from years of ranch work, the strength that had protected her, the gentleness that had never tried to control her. "I love you," she'd said, the words coming out in a rush. "I've been so scared to say it, but I love you, Jake. Not because you saved me, but because of who you are." Jake's smile had been radiant. "I love you too, Elena. I've loved you for months. But I wanted you to be sure. I wanted you to choose me, not just accept me as the best option." They'd been married the following spring in a simple ceremony at the church in Millfield. Elena had worn her grandmother's wedding dress, altered to fit her perfectly, and May had walked her down the aisle since her father had refused to come. The whole town had turned out for the wedding, treating Elena like the daughter they'd all adopted. Even Isabella had come, bringing her little girl and a beautiful handmade quilt as a wedding gift. As Elena had stood at the altar, looking into Jake's eyes as they exchanged vows, she'd thought about the terrified girl who had fled Texas nearly 2 years earlier. That girl had been running from something, but she'd also been running towards something she didn't even know existed. "I choose you," Elena had whispered to Jake as they'd kissed for the first time as husband and wife. "I choose us. I choose this life we're building together." Jake had smiled against her lips. "Best choice you ever made." Looking back now, Elena knew he was right. She'd lost her birth family, but she'd gained something even more precious: the freedom to choose her own path, and the wisdom to choose love over fear, courage over comfort, and hope over despair. In the end, that broken down truck outside Millfield had been the best thing that ever happened to her. It had brought her to this place, to these people, to this man who had watched over her heart until she was ready to give it freely. Elena Martinez Thompson had finally found her home, not in a place, but in the choice to be brave enough to love and be loved in return.